Veiled Queens. There was a time in Britain when a single glance across a ballroom could alter the course of a dynasty. When a daughter's dance card was not merely a social accessory, but a ledger of political possibility. When affection was whispered through wax-sealed letters, yet fortunes and futures were negotiated in lawyers' chambers before the bride ever said yes. Beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the sweep of silk gowns, there was something far more powerful at work. A system designed to preserve rank, wealth, and control through marriage. Tonight, we step into that world. Not the softened fantasy alone, not only the romance we glimpse in dramas like Bridgerton, but the deeper structure beneath it. The rules that governed who could speak, who could dance, who could marry, and who would be quietly erased from society if they crossed invisible lines. The Regency marriage market was not simply about love, it was about power. It was about lineage. It was about survival. Before we continue, I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Whether it is late evening in London, early morning in Sydney, or the quiet hours of night somewhere else entirely, let me know in the comments. And if you are drawn to hidden histories, to the power structures behind elegance and romance, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Veiled Queens, where we uncover the authority that history often conceals beneath beauty. Now, let us return to Regency England. The world we are entering is the Regency era, a period that formally lasted from 1811 to 1820, when George III was deemed unfit to rule due to prolonged mental illness. His son, the Prince of Wales, governed in his place as Prince Regent, later becoming George IV. Yet the customs and social codes we associate with Regency extended beyond those official years, shaping British elite society from the late 18th century into the early decades of the 19th. It was a time of contradiction. Politically, Britain was engaged in the Napoleonic Wars. Economically, industrial change was beginning to reshape the nation. Socially, however, the upper classes clung fiercely to hierarchy. Titles still mattered. Land still defined power. Marriage was still the primary mechanism through which wealth, influence, and stability were preserved. At the center of this world stood the season. The London season was not merely a series of parties. It was a structured migration of the elite from their country estates into the capital, timed to coincide with the sitting of Parliament. Aristocratic families arrived in town as winter softened into spring, filling grand townhouses in Mayfair and St. James's. For the political men, there were debates and alliances. For their unmarried daughters and sons, there was the marriage market. Young women were presented to society, often formally at court. Their debut marked the beginning of eligibility. From that moment, every appearance mattered. Every gown, every dance, every conversation would be weighed. The season revolved around ritualized gatherings, evening balls illuminated by beeswax candles dripping in crystal chandeliers. Assembly rooms vibrating with violins and pianofortes. Dinner parties stretching into the early hours. Opera boxes, where the audience often watched each other more intently than the stage. And then there were the morning calls. Between 11 and 3, drawing rooms across London filled with visitors. These calls were governed by strict timing. 15 minutes was proper. 30 suggested interest. An hour risked scandal. A gentleman could not simply appear unannounced. Introductions were required. A butler controlled entry. A mother or chaperone remained present. Conversation floated politely over teacups and porcelain saucers, yet beneath every word lay evaluation. Did he speak respectfully? Did she appear modest but intelligent? Did their manners align? Was his income sufficient? Was her portion respectable? These visits were soft negotiations, disguised as civility. Afternoons brought another ritual, the promenade in Hyde Park. Along Rotten Row, carriages rolled at a deliberately slow pace, between 5 and 7. It was a public parade of wealth and intention. A gentleman inviting a lady into his carriage was making a statement, not a declaration of love, but a signal of interest visible to hundreds of observers. The air carried the scent of horse leather and early spring grass. Hooves struck the gravel in measured rhythm. Ladies sat upright in carefully chosen walking dresses. Gentlemen demonstrated control over their horses, a subtle metaphor for control over household and fortune. Society watched. It always watched. Privacy in this world was rare. Courtship unfolded under supervision. A young woman could not walk alone with a man. She could not sit beside him on a sofa without a chaperone nearby. Even during dances, one of the few sanctioned forms of physical contact, rules governed proximity. A gentleman might dance twice with the same lady in an evening. 3 times bordered on public declaration. Touch was gloved. Language was formal. First names were forbidden until engagement, and even then, only in private. Letters became a vital bridge between public restraint and private emotion. Wax-sealed and written in careful script, they allowed affection to grow cautiously. Yet even letters carried risk. They could be saved, produced, interpreted. A misplaced phrase might damage a reputation built over generations. The weight of surveillance pressed especially heavily on women. A man's indiscretion might be forgiven, a woman's could destroy her. Reputation was currency. Without it, marriage prospects vanished. And marriage was not optional for most elite women. For daughters of the aristocracy and gentry, marriage was not merely a romantic aspiration, it was economic necessity. A woman who failed to secure a husband often faced lifelong dependence on relatives. A man could delay marriage. A woman's window was narrow. Each season that passed without engagement intensified whispers. Behind the music and silk lay contracts and calculations. Marriage settlements were drafted in legal language, specifying dowries, jointures, property rights. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was absorbed under coverture. Her property became her husband's. Her security depended on negotiated protections written before the wedding day. This was not cruelty in the minds of its participants. It was order. Society believed that matching families of similar rank preserved stability. Cousin marriages were common among the aristocracy to keep estates intact. Romantic love was valued, but only when aligned with suitability. Affection was welcome. Imprudence was not. And yet, within this rigid structure, human feeling persisted. A shared glance during a country dance, a careful compliment during a morning call, the warmth of a letter unfolded in private. Young people navigated constraint with creativity. They learned to communicate in nuance and implication, to build intimacy through patience. The Regency world was therefore not simply a glittering romance, nor merely a cage of rules. It was both. It was a stage where families defended legacy, where daughters bore the burden of virtue, where sons balanced duty and desire, where society enforced hierarchy through ritualized courtship, and where, despite all of it, people still hoped, quietly, stubbornly, to find companionship within the system. The candles burned late into the night, the violins played, carriages circled Hyde Park. Ink dried on thick folded paper sealed with wax. And under the weight of expectation, young men and women measured each other carefully, wondering whether the stranger across the ballroom might become the person with whom they would share the rest of their lives. This was the world of Regency courtship, elegant, controlled, performative, and beneath it, a carefully engineered structure designed to preserve power through marriage. In Regency England, courtship was not dating in the modern sense. It was not spontaneous. It was not private. It was not driven by individual chemistry alone. It was a ritual, choreographed, supervised, codified, and every movement within it carried consequence. A young man and woman could not simply decide to spend time together. They could not meet casually in a cafe, wander alone through a park, or sit side by side in unobserved conversation. Privacy was a luxury denied to them by design. The system was constructed precisely to prevent unsupervised intimacy, because intimacy without oversight threatened reputation, and reputation was everything. A young woman was never permitted to be alone with a gentleman who was not a close relative. Not in a drawing room, not in a garden, not in a carriage, not even for a moment. If she was found unchaperoned with a man, even if nothing improper had occurred, the appearance alone could damage her prospects permanently. In a society that equated virtue with visibility, being seen incorrectly could matter more than what had actually happened. The chaperone was therefore not optional. She was the silent guardian of reputation. Often a mother, an aunt, an older sister, sometimes a trusted married family friend, she remained physically present during calls, walks, dinners, and social engagements. She might sit with embroidery in her lap, appearing distracted, but her ears were attentive. She monitored tone, distance, duration. She knew exactly how long a gentleman had stayed. She noticed whether his chair had been placed too close. She registered whether her daughter's laughter had been too animated or her responses too eager. The chaperone's presence was not merely protective, it was political. She was safeguarding her daughter's value in the marriage market. A single rumor could undo years of careful preparation. A daughter raised to secure a respectable match could not afford even a whisper of impropriety. The language of address reinforced this distance. First names were forbidden territory. A gentleman addressed a young woman as Miss Bennet, never Elizabeth. She called him Mr. Darcy, never Fitzwilliam. This formality was not coldness, it was boundary. Names signaled relationship status. To use a given name was to claim intimacy, and intimacy required sanction. Even engaged couples maintained this formal address in public. Only in private, after a formal proposal and family approval, could first names be spoken freely, and even then, discretion was expected. The world did not need to hear it. The world was always listening. Letters, too, were bound by rules. Writing offered one of the few spaces where deeper sentiment could cautiously unfold. But even there, restraint governed expression. A gentleman could not declare passion recklessly. He must phrase admiration in dignified language. He could speak of esteem, of respect, of hopes for future happiness. But overt declarations of desire would risk impropriety. A young woman replying had to strike an even finer balance. Too warm, and she seemed forward. Too cool, and she discouraged further attention. Every sentence carried weight. Paper was expensive. ink stained permanently. Letters could be preserved, reread, shared. They were physical evidence of character. A misplaced phrase might haunt a woman long after a courtship ended. And then there was dancing. Dancing was the rare sanctioned space for physical proximity. In a crowded ballroom illuminated by candlelight, beneath crystal chandeliers and the murmur of polite society, a gentleman could approach a lady, if properly introduced, and request her hand for a dance. The introduction itself was essential. Without it, the request would be presumptuous. Once introduced, he might dance with her once, possibly twice. But never more than 2 dances in one evening. 3 dances signaled something unmistakable. It was nearly an announcement. Society would assume serious intent. Mothers would notice. Rivals would retreat. Gossip would begin to circulate before the final notes of the orchestra faded. In the structured figures of a country dance, couples came together and separated again in patterned movement. Gloved hands touched briefly, palm to palm, fingertips brushing in orchestrated sequence. Those seconds were charged. A slight pressure, a lingering gaze, the warmth of a hand through kid leather. These were the vocabulary of attraction. They were small gestures, but within a world of restriction, small gestures became enormous. Conversation during dances was fragmented. A sentence begun might not be completed until several turns later, when partners met again in the formation. Words had to be chosen carefully and delivered quickly. There was no space for rambling confession, only coded suggestion. The waltz intensified this tension. When it gained acceptance among the elite, it was considered daring because the gentleman placed his hand at the lady's waist, maintaining contact as they turned together across the floor. It was controlled closeness, but closeness nonetheless. For many young women, it was the most physically intimate experience permitted before engagement. The sensation of spinning together, bodies aligned in rhythm, must have felt both thrilling and dangerous. And yet, even here, eyes watched, always watched. Courtship unfolded in public rooms, drawing rooms filled with relatives, ballrooms crowded with guests, Hyde Park carriage paths lined with observers, opera houses where binoculars were aimed not only at performers, but at the audience itself. Love, if it was to grow, had to grow under scrutiny. This constant evaluation shaped behavior. A young woman learned to regulate her laughter, to lower her gaze modestly but not excessively, to show interest without eagerness. She learned that her posture communicated character, that leaning too closely might invite speculation, that a blush could be interpreted as either innocence or indiscretion, depending on who witnessed it. A young man navigated similar constraints, though with more freedom. He needed to demonstrate steadiness, not volatility, respect, not arrogance, financial competence without crass display. He was being assessed not only by the woman he courted, but by her entire family. His manners towards servants were noted. His temper during a crowded supper was observed. His drinking habits were quietly recorded. Courtship was therefore not simply a private evaluation between 2 hearts. It was a collective examination conducted by society. Every appearance together accumulated meaning. A gentleman who called repeatedly was declaring interest. A lady who accepted his invitations signaled encouragement. But either party withdrawing abruptly would spark conversation. Why had he stopped calling? Why had she refused his dance? Was there a flaw discovered? Had something improper occurred? Reputation functioned like currency. It rose and fell in value with each public interaction. For women, the stakes were particularly severe. A damaged reputation could narrow prospects dramatically. Even unfounded rumors could attach themselves stubbornly to a name. The system was unforgiving. It demanded vigilance and rewarded conformity. Yet within this rigid structure, feeling did emerge. In fact, one might argue that the constraints intensified it. When touch is rare, touch matters. When speech is restricted, words matter. When privacy is denied, stolen glances become electric. A glance across a ballroom could convey encouragement. A carefully chosen quotation in a letter could imply devotion. A repeated dance invitation could speak louder than a declaration. The emotional world of courtship was therefore not absent. It was compressed. It existed in nuance rather than spectacle. For American listeners today, especially women accustomed to autonomy in dating, this system can seem suffocating. The inability to be alone with a man, the constant surveillance, the weight of reputation tied so closely to worth, it feels restrictive, even unjust. And in many ways, it was. But within its boundaries, women exercised subtle forms of power. A lady could refuse a dance. She could decline a call. She could reject a proposal. Her consent was legally required. While economic pressure and family influence were formidable, the final yes belonged to her. During courtship correspondence, she sat in judgment. The gentleman petitioned. He persuaded. He waited. It was one of the few arenas in which her choice carried decisive weight. Still, that choice had to be made within public visibility. Courtship was theatre. Every participant knew their role. Every movement was choreographed. And yet, beneath the choreography, real hearts beat. Affection developed slowly. Compatibility was assessed through observation rather than confession. Patience replaced passion as the guiding principle. The system insisted that love, if it was to exist, must align with propriety. This was not a world of impulsive romance. It was a world of measured advance. Two people began as strangers introduced in formal company. They met again at a ball. They exchanged a few sentences during a dance. He called at her home. She responded to a letter. He drove her through Hyde Park. Weeks passed. Months passed. Each step was deliberate. Each advance visible. Under watchful eyes and whispered speculation, something fragile and hopeful attempted to take root. Courtship in Regency England was therefore neither purely romantic nor purely transactional. It was a ritualized negotiation between individual desire and collective expectation. It was a system designed to regulate attraction without extinguishing it, though at times it came dangerously close. It demanded discipline. It demanded self-control. It demanded that young women, in particular, master the art of being seen without being exposed. And in that disciplined dance, in the gloved hands and restrained letters and carefully measured visits, a generation of women learned how to navigate power through poise, how to protect themselves within limitation, and how to find, when possible, affection inside a structure that never allowed them to forget they were being watched. If courtship was the performance, marriage was the transaction beneath it. Behind every gloved touch, every carefully timed morning call, every dance limited to 2 sets, there was another conversation unfolding, one far less romantic and far more decisive. While young men and women exchanged polite words in drawing rooms, their families were calculating alliances, evaluating fortunes, and protecting legacies that stretched back generations. In Regency England, marriage was never simply about two individuals choosing one another. It was about the joining of families. It was about the preservation of property. It was about maintaining rank in a society where hierarchy structured every opportunity. Love, when it appeared, was welcome, but it was not the foundation. Stability was. For the aristocracy and gentry, estates were not merely homes. They were symbols of lineage, political influence, and inherited authority. Land meant income. Income meant independence, and independence meant power. A poorly chosen marriage could fracture that power in a single generation. Imagine a great estate entailed to pass intact to the eldest son. If that son married a woman without fortune, he might inherit prestige, but lack the liquidity to maintain the property. Roofs decayed, land was sold, influence diminished. But if he married a wealthy heiress, her dowry could pay debts, improve farmland, fund political campaigns, and restore the estate's strength. His choice of bride could determine whether the family name rose or declined. This is why marriage negotiations were rarely private. When a gentleman sought permission to court a young woman seriously, he was not simply declaring affection. He was initiating a financial examination. Her father would inquire into his income, not vaguely, but precisely. How many pounds per year? From what sources? Was it secure land income or risky investment returns? Were there debts, mortgages, obligations to younger siblings? At the same time, his family would assess her portion. How much dowry would accompany her? Was it in cash, in government bonds, in property? Was it already secured or dependent upon future inheritance? These discussions unfolded in lawyers' chambers and correspondence between patriarchs. They were formalized in documents known as marriage settlements, detailed contracts that governed property rights within the union. The marriage settlement was one of the most powerful legal instruments in a woman's life. It specified the dowry, the money or property her family transferred to the marriage. It established how that money would be managed. It outlined her jointure, the income she would receive if widowed. It determined provisions for future children. It anticipated contingencies. What if there were only daughters? What if the husband died early? What if the estate carried debt? Each clause was deliberate. Each signature mattered. Without a carefully negotiated settlement, a woman entered marriage vulnerable. Because once the wedding vows were spoken, the law of coverture took effect. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity merged into her husband's. She could not own property independently. She could not enter contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. Her inheritance, her earnings, even personal items technically fell under her husband's control. To modern American women, this loss of legal personhood can feel shocking, even enraging. But in Regency society, it was normal. It was considered natural that a husband would represent the family in legal and financial matters. The marriage settlement was therefore the bride's shield. It carved out protected income. It ensured she would not be destitute if widowed. It sometimes secured pin money, an annual allowance she could spend without accounting for every penny. Even so, her autonomy narrowed dramatically after marriage. This legal reality heightened the stakes of courtship. A young woman was not simply choosing a companion. She was choosing the man who would control her legal existence. For wealthy families, marriage also served as alliance. titles and estates formed networks of power. A union between a duke's heir and a marquis's daughter consolidated influence. Political loyalties were strengthened through kinship. Land boundaries aligned with bloodlines. Social status was reinforced. Marriage, in this world, functioned as diplomacy. And within this system, class was the invisible wall no one pretended did not exist. Aristocrats married aristocrats. The gentry married within the gentry. Wealthy merchants might aspire upward, but even money had limits. A vast fortune could tempt a titled family facing debt, but whispers would follow. Was it a marriage of desperation? Was the bride's lineage too new, too commercial? Compatibility of rank mattered as much as compatibility of temperament. Women without fortune faced harsher realities. A gentlewoman whose father's finances had declined might possess education, grace, and accomplishments, yet without a substantial dowry, her prospects narrowed. She might marry down socially. She might accept a husband chosen more for solvency than affection. Or she might remain unmarried, dependent on relatives, her talents redirected into governess work or companion roles. The economic imbalance was acute. A man could marry for money and improve his circumstances. A woman rarely could. Her wealth transferred outward. His wealth consolidated inward. And yet, affection was not absent from these calculations. Letters between families often reveal both practical and personal considerations intertwined. A mother might write that a potential bride was amiable and sensible, and add that her portion was £20,000. Neither detail invalidated the other. Both were essential. Regency society did not see romance and finance as opposites. They were complementary concerns. A stable financial foundation was believed to support affection. A marriage built solely on passion without economic prudence was considered reckless. The system aimed to minimize risk, but minimizing risk did not eliminate vulnerability. For women especially, the cost of a miscalculation could be lifelong. A charming suitor might conceal debt. A courteous gentleman might prove controlling once legal authority rested in his hands. During courtship, he petitioned. After marriage, he governed. And still, women navigated this terrain with intelligence. Some learned to read between lines, to ask subtle questions about income and inheritance, to observe how a man treated servants, a glimpse of how he might treat a wife, to consult mothers and aunts who had endured marriage themselves and understood its compromises. Marriage settlements were sometimes arenas where fathers advocated fiercely for daughters' protection. A loving father insisted on a substantial jointure. He negotiated pin money carefully. He demanded security for grandchildren. In those documents, paternal affection became legal safeguard. Yet no document could regulate character. That uncertainty gave courtship its tension. A gentleman might present steady income and respectable lineage, but did he possess kindness, patience, fidelity? These were qualities not written in contracts. Meanwhile, society maintained its double standard. A man's financial imprudence might be forgiven. A woman's lack of fortune was rarely overlooked. A man's moral lapses might be discreetly ignored. A woman's were devastating. Coverture ensured that even a wealthy bride's financial power dissolved into her husband's authority. She might bring enormous funds into the marriage, yet she could not independently control them. Her security depended on trust, and the strength of the settlement negotiated before vows. For American women listening today, this dynamic resonates in uncomfortable ways. The language of partnership remains, but financial power still shapes relationship dynamics. Even now, economic dependence can limit freedom. The Regency system makes visible what modern relationships sometimes obscure. Money is never neutral. In Regency England, this truth was simply acknowledged openly. Marriage preserved estates. It maintained surnames. It aligned political families. It secured dowries for daughters and inheritances for sons. It reinforced the hierarchy that structured society from top to bottom. And yet, within these frameworks, women still sought affection. They hoped not merely for protection, but for companionship. They wanted husbands who valued their opinions, who treated them with respect, who did not abuse the authority the law granted them. Some found it, others endured. The economic scaffolding of Regency marriage does not erase its emotional dimension. It complicates it. Love had to coexist with ledger books. Romance unfolded alongside legal drafts. Courtship smiles masked negotiations conducted behind closed doors. And perhaps that is what makes the system so compelling and so unsettling. Because it forces us to confront a question that echoes beyond history. How much of marriage is about feeling, and how much about structure? How do we balance desire with security, autonomy with alliance? In Regency England, the answer leaned heavily toward preservation. Family alliances mattered more than individual passion. Property stability outweighed romantic risk. And women, despite their grace and accomplishments, bore disproportionate vulnerability within that system. Yet even within coverture, even within settlements drafted in precise legal script, women exercised influence through careful choice, through refusal, through negotiation, through the quiet insistence that they be treated with dignity. The marriage market may have been governed by class and money, but it was navigated by human hearts. And beneath every contract, beneath every dowry calculation and jointure clause, two people still faced each other and decided, within limits, whether to step into a future together. The performance of courtship prepared them for this choice. The financial negotiations framed it. The law constrained it. But the moment of consent, however shaped by pressure and expectation, remained profoundly personal. In that space between obligation and hope, Regency women lived their most consequential decisions, aware that marriage was not merely a romantic union, but the central axis upon which their legal, economic, and social identities would turn for the rest of their lives. If money structured marriage and class determined its boundaries, gender defined who would bear its consequences. Everything we have just explored, the marriage settlements, the dowries, the negotiations behind closed doors, rested upon a deeper imbalance. The legal doctrine of coverture did not simply merge a woman's identity into her husband's. It codified a hierarchy that shaped every aspect of her life. Regency courtship may have appeared symmetrical on the surface, a gentleman petitioning, a lady considering. But once vows were spoken, the asymmetry became unmistakable. A woman's greatest asset before marriage was her reputation, not her wit, not her beauty, not even her dowry. Reputation. From her first season in society, she was evaluated for modesty, restraint, and visible virtue. She could not laugh too loudly, speak too boldly, or accept attention too eagerly. She had to appear desirable, but not available, intelligent, but not intimidating. Warm, but never reckless. Because once damaged, reputation was almost impossible to restore. If a rumor circulated that a young woman had been alone with a gentleman without proper supervision, whispers could grow into conclusions. If she accepted too many dances from one man and he failed to propose, society might speculate that something improper had occurred. Even if entirely innocent, suspicion clung stubbornly. And if the worst happened, if a woman became pregnant outside marriage, the consequences were catastrophic. There was no discreet path forward. The bastardy laws required unmarried mothers to identify the father, but the legal process did little to protect the woman's standing. Instead, it publicly marked her as fallen. Families might disown her to preserve the reputations of other daughters. Prospective husbands would withdraw. Employment opportunities narrowed to domestic service, if she was fortunate. Her life, socially speaking, could be over before it had fully begun. Meanwhile, the man involved often escaped with comparatively minor damage. His moral lapse might be noted, perhaps quietly criticized, but it rarely destroyed his prospects. He retained his property, his income, his legal standing. Society treated his indiscretion as weakness, hers as ruin. This double standard was neither accidental nor subtle. It was foundational. The system depended on certainty of paternity. Estates and titles passed through male lines. For inheritance to function smoothly, society required assurance that a child was legitimately the husband's heir. Therefore, female chastity became a structural necessity. It was not framed primarily as personal morality. It was a safeguard for property transmission. In protecting inheritance, society policed women's bodies. For American women listening today, the sharpness of this imbalance is impossible to ignore. We live in a world where autonomy, at least legally, belongs to women. Yet the echoes of reputation culture still resonate. The scrutiny of female behavior, the harsher judgment of sexual missteps, the disproportionate consequences. In Regency England, these echoes were not subtle. They were law. Divorce was technically possible, but functionally unattainable for most. To dissolve a marriage required a private act of Parliament, an extraordinarily expensive and scandalous process available almost exclusively to wealthy men. A husband could pursue divorce on grounds of his wife's adultery. A wife, however, had to prove not only adultery, but additional offences such as cruelty or abandonment. And even then, the social cost was immense. For a woman, seeking divorce risked losing custody of children. Under the law, children belonged to the father. If she left an unhappy marriage, she might never see them again. Financial survival without family support was nearly impossible. A separated woman lived in social limbo, neither wife nor widow, her reputation perpetually shadowed. Thus, many endured. They endured neglect. They endured emotional coldness. Some endured cruelty, because the alternatives were worse. Men, by contrast, retained far greater latitude. Long as discretion was maintained and public order preserved, society tolerated his behavior. The structure rewarded male autonomy and constrained female resilience. Even within marriage, financial dependence reinforced imbalance. A woman's dowry became her husband's to manage. Her inheritance was absorbed into his estate. While settlements could secure income for widowhood, during marriage she relied on allowances, pin money negotiated beforehand. If he controlled finances tightly, her freedom narrowed further. Economic power and legal authority reinforced one another. Yet within these confines, women were not passive. They developed networks of support through sisters, mothers, and close female friendships. Letters between women reveal intimate conversations about marital dissatisfaction, coping strategies, and shared endurance. Advice passed quietly across generations. Older women guided younger brides on how to manage difficult husbands, how to secure emotional footholds within constraint. And some marriages, importantly, were affectionate partnerships. It would be too simple to paint Regency marriage as universally oppressive. Many husbands valued their wives' judgment, trusted them with estate management, relied on their intelligence in raising children and hosting social obligations. In such households, affection softened hierarchy, but the system itself remained unequal. The requirement for women to maintain absolute moral purity while granting men broader freedom was justified as natural order. Society framed male desire as expected, female desire as dangerous. Women bore the burden of restraint. Even in courtship, this asymmetry shaped behavior. A gentleman might pursue multiple women across seasons without severe censure. A lady who entertained multiple suitors risked appearing flirtatious or unreliable. He was discerning, she was indiscreet. Language reflected this bias. A man sowed wild oats. A woman lost her virtue. These phrases carried weight, and the social penalties reinforced caution. A woman who erred might find herself excluded from drawing rooms, whispered about at assemblies, avoided by former friends. Social death could precede economic hardship. The system's logic was preservation. It preserved lineage, inheritance, and social hierarchy. But preservation demanded control, and control focused disproportionately on women. What makes this reality so compelling and so painful is that it existed alongside genuine hope. Young women entered the season dreaming of affection and partnership. They practiced music, refined conversation, perfected posture not merely to secure wealth, but to secure happiness. They were asked to balance aspiration with vigilance. The emotional toll of constant self-regulation must have been immense. To monitor laughter, to measure glances, to guard physical space, to know that one impulsive moment could reverberate through an entire lifetime. Yet women navigated this terrain with extraordinary intelligence. They mastered nuance. They wielded refusal strategically. They evaluated suitors carefully, understanding that acceptance meant surrendering legal independence. Consent, in this context, was heavy. When a woman accepted a proposal, she was not merely choosing companionship. She was choosing to enter a legal framework that would limit her rights, bind her finances, and define her public identity. The weight of that decision sharpened discernment. Some women rejected advantageous matches because they sensed cruelty beneath charm. Others accepted modest prospects because kindness outweighed wealth. These choices reveal agency within limitation. Still, structural inequality remained. The system did not collapse because of its injustice. It endured because it functioned efficiently for those who benefited most: landowners, patriarchs, political families. Social order depended on predictable inheritance and regulated female sexuality. And yet, even within this system, cracks appeared. Literature from the period hints at critique. Novels portrayed foolish or tyrannical husbands. They celebrated heroines who insisted on respect and compatibility. These narratives did not overturn law, but they questioned assumptions. The cultural conversation about marriage was not static. For American women listening today, the Regency world can feel distant and unrecognizable. Yet its patterns illuminate enduring themes: the negotiation between autonomy and security, the cost of reputation, the unequal consequences of desire. While modern law grants women rights unimaginable in 1815, social judgment remains uneven. Economic dependence still shapes choices. Cultural expectations still pressure women to balance attractiveness with restraint. The Regency system exposes these dynamics in stark relief. It shows us a society that openly prioritized male authority and female purity, a society that believed stability required unequal sacrifice, a society that punished women more harshly, not because they were weaker, but because their bodies were central to inheritance. And yet, women persisted. They loved when they could. They endured when they must. They raised daughters who entered the same system armed with the lessons of their mothers. They shaped households, influenced estates, and quietly steered family futures from within domestic spaces. Power did not vanish, it shifted form. The imbalance between men and women defined Regency marriage, but it did not erase female resilience. It created a world where caution was survival, where reputation was armor, where love had to coexist with legal vulnerability. Understanding this inequality deepens our understanding of the entire courtship system. The strict supervision, the chaperones, the formal language, all of it functioned to protect women's reputations precisely because the consequences of loss were so severe. The elaborate ritual was not simply decorum, it was defense. Defense of inheritance, defense of lineage, defense of social order. But in defending structure, it often sacrificed fairness. And so, as we move through this world of ballroom glitter and legal contracts, we must hold two truths simultaneously. The system created stability, and the system punished women more harshly than men. It preserved estates, it constrained wives, it elevated male freedom, it demanded female vigilance. And within that imbalance, young women still stepped into candlelit rooms each season, hopeful, composed, and acutely aware that their futures depended not only on whom they loved, but on how perfectly they performed virtue under watchful eyes. And yet, despite everything, love still found a way in. After all the contracts, after the surveillance, after the double standards and the suffocating weight of reputation, something deeply human persisted. Beneath the choreography of courtship and the calculations of marriage settlements, there were still two people standing across from one another in a candlelit room, wondering if this stranger might become their companion for life. That is perhaps the most remarkable truth of the Regency world. Because it would be easy to assume that a system so rigid, so unequal, so structured around property and lineage would suffocate genuine feeling. That affection would be crushed beneath obligation. That women, so constrained and vulnerable, would approach marriage only as survival. But history and private letters tell a more complicated story. many couples did develop real attachment. Not the explosive, reckless passion modern cinema often celebrates, but something quieter, something steadier, something built through observation and patience. In a world where people could not be alone together, they learned to read each other in fragments. A glance held across a crowded ballroom, a pause in conversation during a morning call, a subtle change in tone within a carefully worded letter. When touch is limited, attention sharpens. When speech is restricted, listening deepens. A gentleman who danced twice with a lady during a single evening was making a statement. If he called regularly, if he wrote thoughtfully, if he remembered her preferences in books or music, these gestures accumulated meaning. They were not grand declarations. They were consistent acts of regard, and consistency mattered. For women especially, steadiness was more reassuring than passion. A man who showed reliable attentiveness over months, who respected boundaries, who honored propriety, who treated her family with courtesy, signaled character. In a society where marriage meant legal vulnerability, character was everything. Women observed carefully. They watched how a suitor spoke to servants. They noticed whether he listened or merely talked. They registered whether his humor was kind or cutting. They evaluated not just charm, but temperament. Love, in this context, did not begin as infatuation. It began as assessment. And slowly, assessment could soften into admiration. Admiration could warm into affection. Affection could deepen into love. Letters played an essential role in this transformation. Because spoken conversation was constrained by supervision, written correspondence offered space. Not complete privacy, but relative intimacy. In letters, a gentleman could reveal his interior world in ways impossible during a public dance. He could describe his hopes, his anxieties, his plans for the estate he hoped to inherit. He could quote poetry that suggested feeling without violating propriety. A woman responding could show wit, intelligence, and discernment. She could reveal her values, what she believed made a happy household, how she envisioned partnership, what she admired in others. Through letters, two minds could meet. For American women listening today, accustomed to instant communication and rapid emotional escalation, this slowness might feel foreign. But there is something powerful about gradual revelation. Affection built on patience has a different texture. It does not ignite in a single dramatic moment. It gathers quietly, like warmth spreading from a hearth. It grows through repetition, through seeing the same person behave with integrity over and over again. In the Regency world, time functioned as a filter. A suitor who persisted across seasons demonstrated more than attraction. He demonstrated commitment. A lady who continued to welcome his attentions was signaling trust. Trust, perhaps more than passion, was the foundation of Regency love. And within the inequality we discussed, within coverture and legal dependence, many couples consciously worked to create partnership. Husbands who valued their wives' judgment consulted them in household management. Wives who respected their husbands' responsibilities supported them socially and politically. Love, here, often meant mutual respect. It meant recognizing that marriage was not simply romance, but alliance, and choosing to make that alliance tender rather than merely functional. Of course, not every marriage achieved this. Some unions remained cold. Some women endured disappointment. But many letters between spouses decades into marriage reveal warmth, humour, and genuine fondness. There are husbands writing from London to country homes, expressing impatience to return to their wives. There are wives describing pride in their husbands' achievements. There are couples who mourned each other deeply when separated by illness or death. These are not the documents of mere convenience. They are evidence that affection could thrive even within constraint. Perhaps, paradoxically, the very limitations of the system intensified emotional focus. Because physical boundaries were firm, emotional intimacy had to develop intellectually first. Two people came to know each other's minds before sharing physical space. They evaluated values before experiencing passion. They built emotional scaffolding before consummation. This order, mind before body, created a distinctive kind of bond. For women whose legal autonomy would vanish upon marriage, this prior knowledge mattered profoundly. Loving a husband's character, not merely his position, offered some security against the imbalance of power. And love, in this world, was not dramatic rebellion. It was often quiet alignment. A couple might begin with mutual suitability, compatible families, adequate fortune, shared rank, and then discover shared humour, shared reading preferences, shared concern for siblings, shared patience. Gradually, admiration became attachment. Attachment became dependence of a gentler kind, emotional reliance rather than economic vulnerability. This slow growth was sometimes misinterpreted by later generations as lack of romance. But romance does not require spectacle. It requires recognition. Recognition that another person sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. Within drawing rooms and carriage rides, beneath chandeliers and over carefully folded paper, many women found that recognition. They found men who valued their intelligence, who respected their composure, who admired not just beauty, but steadiness. And in choosing such men, they exercised agency. Because even within family pressure, even within financial negotiation, a woman's consent was necessary. She could refuse. She could decline proposals that felt wrong. She could prioritize kindness over wealth, stability over glamour. That discernment shaped love. Love in Regency England was rarely impulsive. It was cultivated. It unfolded through repeated encounters, through letters exchanged over months, through seasons separated by distance and tested by patience. When a couple reunited after summer months apart, after maintaining correspondence and loyalty, their affection had survived absence. That endurance strengthened attachment. In a culture that prized constancy, love expressed itself through reliability. He wrote faithfully. She responded thoughtfully. He returned when promised. She waited without wavering. These were not small things. In a world governed by reputation and performance, authenticity revealed itself through consistency. For modern listeners, especially women who have navigated relationships shaped by speed and uncertainty, there is something unexpectedly reassuring about this model. Not the inequality, not the legal constraints, but the deliberateness. The insistence that partnership be evaluated carefully, that character be observed before vows are spoken, that affection deepen over time rather than flare and fade. Regency love was not fireworks, it was architecture, constructed layer by layer, supported by observation, reinforced by correspondence, strengthened by patience. And when it succeeded, it created marriages that endured not because passion remained constant, but because respect did. Husbands and wives who began with measured admiration often grew into companions who knew each other intimately. Habits, weaknesses, strengths, vulnerabilities. They navigated estate crises together, raised children side by side, faced illness and aging with shared history binding them. Love, in this sense, became quieter but deeper. It was not the breathless intensity of a stolen kiss behind a curtain. It was the familiarity of shared breakfast conversations decades later. It was the comfort of knowing how the other took tea, the reassurance of steady presence. Within the imbalance of gender and law, many couples consciously softened hierarchy with affection. A husband might technically possess authority, but emotional partnership could equalize daily life. These marriages complicate our understanding of the Regency world. They remind us that even within unjust systems, individuals seek kindness. They create warmth where structure is cold. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. Systems shape relationships. Laws constrain them. Economics influence them. But human beings still long for connection. Even under watchful eyes, even beneath restrictive codes, even when legal frameworks tilt power unevenly. A woman stepping into a ballroom during the season carried more than ambition for security. She carried hope. Hope that among the measured conversations and regulated dances, she might find someone who saw beyond the performance. And sometimes she did. Sometimes love emerged not despite the system, but through it, refined by patience, clarified by observation, strengthened by deliberation. It was not loud, it was not reckless, it was slow, attentive, and intentional. And in that slowness, in that deliberate unfolding, many Regency women discovered a form of love that, though constrained by its time, was no less real, and perhaps, in its steadiness, remarkably enduring. And this is where the story moves beyond candlelight and contracts, because what we have been tracing is not simply the mechanics of Regency courtship, not only the chaperones, the settlements, the gloved hands and wax seals. What we have been uncovering is something larger, something that stretches far beyond early 19th century England. This is not merely a portrait of how they loved. It is a meditation on how humans, in every era, must negotiate between the heart and the world around it. In the Regency period, that negotiation was visible, it was formal, it was codified into rituals and contracts. Society stood physically present in drawing rooms, in ballrooms, in Hyde Park. Mothers listened, lawyers drafted, neighbors whispered, reputation was currency, and surveillance was constant. The pressure was tangible, but if we step back from the silks and chandeliers and consider our own time, the pressure has not disappeared. It has only changed form. Regency England had rigid social codes. We have algorithms. They had morning calls governed by propriety. We have curated profiles shaped by invisible standards. They had the marriage market during the season. We have dating apps, economic anxiety, career timelines, and social media commentary that can elevate or dismantle reputations overnight. The structure is different. The tension is the same. In Regency society, a woman balanced her desire for affection with the necessity of security. She weighed compatibility against fortune. She considered whether a man's character would protect her within a legal system that would not. Today, women still weigh similar questions, though under different laws. Is he emotionally steady? Is he financially responsible? Does he respect my independence? Can I build a future with him that feels safe, not just exciting? The language has evolved, but the internal calculation remains. In Regency England, the stakes were survival within a patriarchal structure. In modern America, the stakes may be framed differently: emotional fulfillment, financial partnership, shared values. Yet the negotiation between heart and structure persists. We still measure compatibility against culture. We still ask whether love alone is enough. We still feel the tension between desire and expectation. In that sense, Regency courtship becomes less distant and more intimate. It reveals a universal truth. Partnership has always existed at the intersection of private longing and public reality. The young woman in 1815, stepping into a ballroom, wanted to be chosen, not simply for her dowry or her manners, but for herself. She wanted to be seen, truly seen, within the confines of a system that often reduced her to reputation and portion. The woman today, scrolling through profiles, navigating career ambitions, family expectations, and financial pressures, wants the same thing: to be chosen, to be valued, to be loved not as an accessory to someone else's life, but as an equal participant in it. Regency women balanced hope with caution. They knew that affection could blossom slowly, that compatibility mattered, that passion without stability could lead to ruin. Modern women balance independence with vulnerability. They know that chemistry without respect is fragile, that ambition without partnership can feel isolating, that social approval does not guarantee emotional safety. The forms change, the longing does not. And perhaps that is why the Regency world continues to captivate us. Not because it was more romantic, not because it was more elegant, but because it dramatized the negotiation we still live inside. Every generation builds its own rules around love. Some rules are written into law, others into culture, others into expectation. In the Regency era, those rules were visible in chaperones and contracts. Today, they are embedded in economic realities, gender norms, digital performance, and subtle social hierarchies. But the central question remains remarkably constant. Can I follow my heart without losing my place in the world? For Regency women, losing one's place could mean social exile. For women today, it might mean financial instability, public scrutiny, or emotional vulnerability. The consequences are different in scale, but the emotional calculus is strikingly similar. What makes the Regency system particularly revealing is that it forces us to confront how much of partnership is shaped by structure rather than pure feeling. We like to imagine love as free, spontaneous, unconstrained, untouched by external pressure. But history tells a more complicated story. Love has always been negotiated within context, within family, within economy, within law, within expectation. Even the most passionate Regency couple could not escape the necessity of settlements and social approval. Even the most independent modern couple cannot escape mortgages, careers, family dynamics, and cultural norms. The ballroom is gone, the scrutiny remains. And yet, across centuries, one desire persists unchanged: to be chosen. To stand across from another human being and hear, whether spoken aloud or implied through action, "I choose you." Not because it is financially advantageous, not because it satisfies expectation, not because it preserves a family name, but because something in your character, your mind, your presence feels like home. Regency courtship, for all its restrictions, left space for that recognition. In the quiet of letters written late at night, in the subtle understanding formed over repeated dances, in the steady accumulation of respect. It reminds us that love does not require spectacle to be real. It requires attention. It requires discernment. It requires the courage to align feeling with wisdom. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson beneath the wax seals and waltzes. Every era demands that women calculate risk. Every era demands that they weigh autonomy against belonging. But every era also carries the possibility of partnership rooted in mutual regard. The Regency women who navigated rigid rules were not naive. They understood the stakes, they understood the structure, and still they hoped. They hoped that within the constraints of their world they might find not merely a protector, but a companion. Not merely a husband, but an ally. That hope is timeless. As we close this journey, the ballrooms fade, the chandeliers dim, the letters dry and crumble at their edges. The contracts remain archived in quiet libraries. But what remains most vividly is not the legal doctrine of coverture or the intricacies of dowry negotiation. It is the image of a young woman standing at the edge of a crowded room, aware of expectation pressing against her, and still daring to imagine that among all the watching eyes there might be one pair that sees her clearly and chooses her. History often remembers the laws and the estates. It rarely centers the quiet courage of women navigating them, and that is why we tell these stories here. Because beneath the elegance of Regency England lay a structure designed to preserve power. And within that structure, women carved spaces for dignity, discernment, and, sometimes, deep affection. This is not nostalgia. It is recognition. Recognition that power shapes love. Recognition that women have always balanced vulnerability with strength. Recognition that partnership has always been both personal and political. And, as always, when we strip away the illusion of romance and look instead at the framework beneath it, we find something more compelling than fantasy. We find resilience. We find negotiation. We find women who understood the rules of their world and learned to move within them without surrendering entirely to them. This is Veiled Queens, where we look beyond silk and sparkle, where we examine the systems behind the story, where we uncover the power and the cost hidden beneath history's elegance. Thank you for stepping into this world with me. Until next time, remember, beneath every grand narrative of love lies a structure of power, and beneath that structure, women have always been navigating, choosing, and enduring with far more strength than history often admits. I will see you again on Veiled Queens.